Before I jump right in, I'll begin by saying the past several weeks or so at my job have been particularly, I don't know if the word difficult is the word I want to use, but um, anxiety producing maybe. But probably the best word is just strange. Um, and part of what I'm going to talk about today comes out of that because the past several weeks have left me sort of back in a place that I once was, of wondering um, who I really am, what I'm really doing, um, what it's all about. It's just a lot of stuff that's up in the air. It's sort of um, cyclically turbulent there, not quite knowing what's going to go on from day to day, and wondering not just how my one day schedule is going to change that morning, but where I'm going to be in the next week or month or even a year down the line has been sort of up in the air, which is for me, gets me back to some old stuff that I always have to work through. But today, unlike usually when I'm with you, I'm not going to tell a story, but I am going to talk about the power of telling our own stories. I'll probably have, I mean, because of who I am, I'm going to have to tell some story. I can't seem to speak to people without bringing a story into it. But what this really is kind of a meta story, a story about storytelling, about the story of our lives. Growing up, I was told, and I began telling a story to myself of being weak and awkward and scrawny and inept as a kid. And that story was not only told to me by the other kids at school, but by my siblings and to a certain extent by my parents, and also by my teachers at school, particularly one teacher that I will always remember, Mr. Pappas, the gym teacher. I said I was going to tell a story, but this just literally just came to mind. One of the things Mr. Pappas would do was, if you broke the rules in gym, he had a target on the wall, and he would make you sit in the target and say, "Don't move," while he threw balls at your head, but would always miss your head. And you were just really scared. But the more scared you got, the more made fun of you got. And I was always one of those ones that was really scared. But that story of weakness, of ineptness, of awkwardness, became not just the story I told myself, but I became weakness, and I became ineptitude, and I became scrawniness, and I became awkwardness. It wasn't just that I was awkward, I was awkwardness. And for many years, that was me. It was the story I told about who I was. It became myself, my identity. It became my identity. It was all I was, and it was all I, for a very long time, believed I could ever be. Part of it was because if you put me on a basketball court or a baseball field, and I ended up proving to myself and to the whole world that I was completely inept and unable to do anything correctly. If what I was doing involved anything that required my hand and my eyes to work together, forget it, I was done. And I know, I mean, I'm laughing at it now, but at the time it was so deeply disturbing and hurtful to me, that I buried myself in myself, and I no longer was able to reach out to others. And I began to learn that it was unsafe for me to go to anybody for help. I couldn't be vulnerable because that vulnerability that vulnerability was just it would just prove the weakness that I was so afraid of. And so I turned inward. But the truth was, I was none of those things, but weakness and ineptitude and scrawniness, they were all lying to me, telling me all the things I could not do, all the things I could never be. And that story I was telling infected my entire life and almost everything I did. I didn't really know who I was in many ways. I was a stranger, living lost in the strangeness of life. And I think we've all felt the strangeness of life at times. We have all looked around sometimes and wondered, who are we? We have felt alone and unwanted and cast out and unknown. We felt like there's no room at the table for us. Our culture confers upon us an identity based on certain kind of markers that are out there. And oftentimes our place in society depends on these markers being clear and visible to others and to ourselves. And we can't lose sight of those, or we lose sight of ourselves, we think. So each role we fulfill, father, husband, brother, daughter, sister, mother, wife, whatever it is, each job we do, minister or teacher or salesperson or engineer or artist or executive, each has its place in helping us create a known and discernible identity for ourselves. And that identity that we create is both external, right? We present it to the world and present it to society, and it's internal. It becomes often how we understand ourselves and then how we are supposed to relate to the world. And so it's sort of this cycle of we present ourselves to the world in this way, and then we behave in that way so we can match what the world is telling us to be. And it is through this sort of potentially creative process that we build ourselves. It's a kind of storytelling in which we create our own meaning and value in the world. And so it is not enough for one to simply be a father, right? Which taken by itself is a statement of a certain kind of relationship. To say I'm a father in and of itself, it just talks about paternity, right? And genetics. It doesn't have any meaning or value. There has to be some value placed on the roles that we have and then how we fulfill that. So each day I tell the story of me being a father and thereby create myself. The kind of story I create determines the kind of meaning I will have. And if I tell myself I'm a good father, it may mean one thing. And if I start telling myself I'm not so good, it might mean another. So most of us who are fathers want to be good ones. So we attach certain labels to that, like compassionate, caring, and loving and nurturing. And there are certain things that a compassionate and caring and nurturing father must do, in part based on such subjective things as how you might understand those values for yourself, but also how society defines those things, and also on what it really means to be compassionate and caring and loving when we put those things into actions. And so the question that I then came up with as I was thinking about this is, what happens when I fail to live up to those ideals, which every one of us will, and God know I have failed to live up to those ideals? Do I then tell myself a story that is all I can be? Do I tell a story that all I can ever be is the one who failed and that is all I can live up to? Or do I tell a story of learning and growth? You see, that story that we are telling ourselves about who we are matters infinitely, because the story can become who we are. And that sense of strangeness that we can develop, the feeling of being lost in a world of things beyond our control and out of our reach, begins when we tell these very thin stories of ourselves. And a thin story is this negative, problem-laden story. It's just the surface. And we pick out all those bad things. We tell those thin stories, and that is just the surface, but we don't get down beneath it, and we begin to think that's what we are. Some of those stories are like my childhood story, and honestly, if I'm being honest about it, that is not just my childhood story. It's a story that continues to run through my life right up to this day. We can tell those stories of our lives as things we are not, things we cannot be. And we tend to speak to ourselves in stories of failure or disappointment or regret, often fueled by a cultural narrative of what the ideal me must be, narratives that are most of the time out of reach. That's the horribly pernicious thing about these cultural stories that we take on as our identity, is they are always out of reach. We will never be able to be that ideal, and yet so often we struggle reaching toward it and feeling like we failed at being something that is impossible to become. Mine was the story that boys, particularly American, even going a little further, particularly boys from Jersey, and then boys from a particular place in Jersey, have to be athletic and strong, or they are not really boys at all. If I wasn't the boy on the cover of Boy's Life, who the hell was I? And then there's this other cultural narrative that was laid on top of that, which is so wrapped up in systemic homophobia and misogyny that if I wasn't a boy, then I must be a girl. I must be feminine, and there's something really wrong with a boy appearing feminine. And the worst thing you could be as a boy in Jersey in 1977, 78 was a feminine person. In the confusion and the pressure of the many roles we are asked to fill, it's easy to lose sight of the unique and sacred self seeking to fulfill them. And that's what had happened to me. I lost sight of myself. I began simply going through the motions in my life, completing the concrete requirements of the various roles that and labels that are placed on me, but never becoming engaged in the story of myself and telling the story of who I really am. And when I started in the beginning, and I said, work has been really hard, right? It's just, I don't really know what's going on. That same feeling I noticed that I had when I was a kid in Jersey was the same feeling I started to feel in the last several months, that I was failing in a way, that I couldn't live up to what I was supposed to be. And then soon, if I'm not careful, like happened in my childhood, everything seemed to lack meaning and value. I was just lost. And that can happen to any of us at any time in our lives. And when it does, the jobs we do or the relationships we engage in start to feel empty, and we feel personally empty as well. And then lacking any markers or touchstones to which to really locate our sacred selves, we feel lost in this world of relativity and meaninglessness. And then, for me at least, the really, again, pernicious part of this is I learned that the worst thing I could do when I felt like that was reach out to somebody for help. That to reach out for help was to prove the weakness, and so I collapsed back into myself. And I recognize now that through years of therapy and thought that when I start to feel that desire to go in myself, I need to look at what is happening around me. Because my story as a kid became one of that meaninglessness, of that insignificance, of that futility of even trying. And this, more than any other complaint, is the spiritual malady I most often hear about from the people I serve. People tell me stories of being empty, stories of being strangers even to themselves. And it is perhaps the most painful and debilitating one because it's so pervasive. And it seems like that's all there is. It takes over. It's being lost in a deep darkness without any kind of consistency to it. There's no one thing to point to that is the basis or cause of the feelings of meaninglessness. There is no single powerful event or loss or tragedy or disappointment or trauma to be dealt with. It's just the way things are. And when lost in that way, it's almost impossible to become found completely on your own. It usually takes the help of others, of friends, of family, of a skilled or compassionate therapist, of a spiritual community who can help you start to tell a new story of yourself. We need those kind of people and those communities to place fixed points clearly before our eyes, reminding us that none of us are just the sum of the roles that we fill, and that the problems that we face are not who we are. We are more than the labels we place upon ourselves. We each have value and meaning simply because we are. And I say that a lot. We have meaning and value simply because we are. Our existence is the meaning of our lives. This kind of relationship in which the worth and dignity of another is reflected back to them is what Martin Buber called the I-thou relationship. He wrote, "When I confront a human being as my thou and speak the basic word I-thou to her, then he is no longer a thing among other things, nor does she consist of things. He is no longer a he or she limited by other he's and she's, a dot in a world grid of space or time, nor a condition that can be experienced or described, not a loose bundle of named qualities. No, neighborless and seamless, she is thou, and thou fills the firmament." Not as if there were nothing but he or she, but everything lives in that light. It goes on to say, "I do not find the human being to whom I say thou in any sometime or somewhere. I can place that person there, but again, to do that, they immediately become a he or a she or an it, and no longer the thou." And this is the line in this quote that just lives with me all the time. "As long as the firmament of the thou is spread over me, the tempest of causality cowers at my heels, and the whirl of doom congeals." That last line, "the whirl of doom congeals," is so powerful to me. And I'm a visual thinker, and so I see it in my mind as this whirl of things that are telling me what I need to be are swirling around me. And that whirl, as I enter into that I-thou relationship with another person, as some other human being reflects back to me my sacred worth, I see it in my mind of that tempest begins to slow, and the power of its fear contracts, and finally all those things just fall to the ground, feeble and immobilized. And I know that happens. I have seen that happen in almost an instant in therapy sessions with the people who I sit with. And I call therapy with people sitting with them because it is that relationship that matters. I have seen in those sessions that whirl of doom congeal as someone begins to see in their heart their sacred worth. And here's the thing, right? I don't do anything all that special other than listen to the story being told and try to discover in those things these sparkling moments in people's lives, these unique outcomes that they have when the person is more than the issue or more than the problem, more than the fear or the illness that they are facing. People come to me as strangers. Strangers to myself and strangers to them. Most often, they've become strangers to themselves and others because of the stories they have been telling. Their life's narrative has become one of failure and disappointment and regret, fueled by cultural narratives of what they must be. And over and over and over again, they tell these stories of strangeness to themselves reflexively, as if there is no other story to be told. It becomes habitual and painful, but despite the pain of holding on to that story, people come to believe there is nothing else, no other story to be told. But here's the thing too. Always, I guarantee you, interwoven with buried deep underneath those thin stories of pain, there is another story, this suppressed narrative, an alternative story to be told. And together, we just sit and talk and uncover that other story. The story that speaks of triumph and fulfillment and pride. And what I've often found is that we very often confuse ourselves with the problems that we face and the problem stories we tell ourselves. And so soon we are depression or we are anxiety. And then those negative labels that culture foists on us become us. And we believe that's all we are. Some people have been called lazy or stupid or irresponsible for so long, they believe they are irresponsible or stupid or laziness. And those descriptions are always focused on weakness and shame and inadequacy. And if you ever found yourself lost in those negative stories, overwhelmed by the whirl of doom, let me tell you this, you are not alone. You are not alone. All of us at some times in our lives, maybe a lot of times in our lives, have felt like this. And at these times, ask yourself not what it means to have anxiety or be depressed, but instead ask, what are the lies that your anxiety is telling you? Ask, how is depression lying to me right now? Use those words like titles for a thing that's outside of yourself somewhere. Because those things are not you. The fear is not you. The stupid is not you. The laziness is not you. The irresponsibility is not you. Even if you have one of those fancy diagnostical statistical manual number 5 diagnoses, that diagnosis is not you. We lose ourselves when we come to believe the problems are us, but they are not. We are all so much more. I have said it before, and I believe with the depth of my being that we are our stories. And that's why I believe it is so important to know the stories we tell ourselves in our lives. So let me take you back now to my story, that scrawny, inept kid story. One day, I think I was probably about 15, my mom took me to a county fair where I saw a group of people fighting each other with big, heavy wooden swords. It was part of this medieval recreation group. And they were doing this demonstration. And for some reason, I saw those people doing that, and I looked at her and I said, I'm going to do that. And never before in my life had I ever been so sure of something. And I still get choked up when I talk about this. I did it. I went to that group. That group took me in without judgment, without pejoratives, just as I was. It was an extremely athletic thing that required my hand and my eyes to work together. And you know what? Because that group took me in just as I was without judgment, I became really, really good at fighting with swords. And soon my whole story changed. I was strong, and I was skillful, and I was competent. And when that story changed, I also went from being painfully socially awkward to confident standing in front of others. I went from being standoffish to affable, from being defensive and angry to being open and compassionate. That new story changed everything about myself to the point where today I am an athlete. I run ultra marathons, and I still fight with swords, and I'm still pretty good at it. And I know, and I can't express this enough. I never believed I would be able to say this about myself, that I am kind and thoughtful and compassionate man who maybe sometimes feels too much for my own good. But now as I look back, what I recognize is those things were always there. Right? I was never inept. I was never weak. I was never scrawny. I was never mean or angry like I thought I needed to be to defend myself. But the negative story I believed was true blinded me to the alternative story I could have been telling myself. And I am forever grateful to all those in my life who helped me tell that new story and continue to be a part of my unfolding story today. So I would ask you, what is the story you are telling yourself today that may not be true, that you may not want to live anymore? And even more important, what is the alternate story going on right now in your life that you might not quite hear? What is your story that can help you find yourself, that can help you, as that old spiritual says, help you become found where once you were lost? Listen very carefully. Listen, and that story that you are telling now, that new story that is going on, will help end the strangeness that follows us all. What are the times when the stranger's story was not true? What are your sparkling moments when the dominant story, the negative story, wasn't happening? Those little landmarks will help you locate yourself in the strangeness of this world. This is where your new story can begin, but it is not where it will end. The stories we live, the stories we believe, do not end with our deaths, but are told again and again and again, long after our last breath, which is why our stories are so important. Because our stories are our legacy. They are what lives on after us. They are what become who we are. Because we are our stories. And so I would ask you, who will you be today and every day forward? Amen.